The doctor froze. The Bobcat had just pressed its paw against the old woman's chest, and the heart monitor beeped back to life. Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Holloway had been dead for 3 minutes, but her lips moved. A whisper escaped, soft, broken, and impossible. "Take care of him. He knows the truth." Then the monitor flatlined again, and the Bobcat turned its golden eyes onto the doctor. Dr. Evelyn Carter had seen many deaths in her career. As a physician at St. Mary's Hospice, she was no stranger to the quiet passing of life. It was part of the job, a reality she had come to accept. But this was different. Her hands trembled as she stared at Mrs. Holloway's lifeless form. The woman was gone, really gone. Yet, for a fleeting moment, she had spoken, and the Bobcat, it had done something. The room remained deathly silent, except for the distant hum of hospital equipment. The nurses stood frozen, their faces pale. One of them muttered a prayer under her breath. Another backed away toward the door, eyes locked on the animal. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the Bobcat. It sat there perfectly still, not mourning, not afraid, just waiting. Waiting for what? Her fingers twitched at her sides. She should have called security, should have ushered everyone out, but she couldn't move because something felt off. The air in the room felt too heavy, as if something unseen lingered, as if Mrs. Holloway hadn't left alone. "Doctor?" One of the nurses finally broke the silence. Did you hear that?" Evelyn swallowed. Yes, she had. But how could she explain it? How could she put into words the impossible thing that had just happened? She took a slow, careful breath and turned back toward the body. Mrs. Holloway's face looked peaceful now. There was no indication that she had just spoken after death. No sign of what had occurred, except for the Bobcat, staring at her as if it was waiting for a response. Evelyn's voice came out hoarse. Did she say something? The nurses exchanged nervous glances. They had all heard it, but no one wanted to be the first to confirm it, because confirming it meant accepting it. Evelyn forced herself to think logically. Maybe it was a hallucination, the stress of the moment playing tricks on them. Maybe it was a death reflex, an exhale that only sounded like words. But deep down she knew that wasn't it. The words had been deliberate, a message, and the Bobcat was still watching her. Evelyn finally moved. She stepped toward the body and adjusted the blanket over Mrs. Holloway's frail frame, her mind racing. Take care of him. He knows the truth. Her eyes flickered to Bobcat. Was that message meant for her? She hesitated, then glanced at the nurses. Who brought the Bobcat in? Silence. The women shifted uncomfortably. One of them finally spoke. It was already here, doctor. Evelyn frowned. What do you mean? Who let it in? No one. The answer sent a chill down her spine. She turned back to the animal. It didn't belong to the hospital. No one had reported a wild Bobcat roaming the halls. So how had it gotten here? And more importantly, why did it look like it belonged? The Bobcat finally moved. It stood, stretched its muscular frame, and padded slowly toward her. The nurses tensed. One of them took a step back. But Evelyn didn't move. The animal stopped just a foot away. Up close, she could see the strange intelligence in its golden eyes. It wasn't just an animal. It was something more. A slow chill crawled up her spine. She found her voice. What are you? For a brief second, she thought she saw something shift in its gaze. Something old, something knowing. Then, in the same calm manner, it turned away and walked toward the door. And stopped. It didn't leave. It was waiting. For her. Evelyn's heartbeat pounded in her ears. A thought formed in her mind, one she couldn't shake. It wants me to follow it. She knew she shouldn't. She knew this was insane. But as she looked at the lifeless body on the bed, as she remembered the impossible whisper that had sent shivers down her spine, she knew. She had no choice. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped forward, and the Bobcat led her out of the room. Evelyn followed the Bobcat down the dimly lit hospital corridor, the sterile scent of antiseptic mixing with something heavier, an unshakable feeling that she was walking into something far beyond her understanding. She should have turned back. She should have called security. But the image of Mrs. Holloway's lifeless body, her whispered last words, and the impossible moment when the bobcat pressed his paw against her chest, none of it made sense. And that was exactly why Evelyn couldn't walk away. The bobcat moved with quiet confidence, weaving through the halls with a kind of grace that didn't belong in a hospital. It didn't hesitate, didn't sniff the air or glance around in confusion. It knew exactly where it was going. Evelyn swallowed hard, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. "Where are you taking me?" The bobcat didn't respond. Of course it wouldn't, but the way its ears flicked back, as if it had heard her anyway, made the hair on her arms rise. A flickering hallway light buzzed overhead as she turned the corner. Then suddenly the bobcat stopped, and Evelyn's stomach twisted, because she recognized the door in front of them. Room 214, Mrs. Holloway's old room, the room where the elderly woman had lived for months, where she had spent her last days, where she had... Why here? Evelyn hesitated, staring at the closed door as dread coiled in her chest. The room should have been empty. The nurses would have already stripped the bed, cleaned the space, and prepped it for another patient. But before she could move, before she could even question it, the bobcat pushed the door open with its paw. The hinges creaked. Evelyn's breath caught. The room wasn't empty. A man sat in the chair by the window. She froze. At first, she thought maybe it was just a trick to the dim light. Maybe one of the staff had come in to take a break, or a visitor had accidentally wandered into the wrong room. But the moment her eyes landed on him, she knew this wasn't a visitor. He sat unnaturally still, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his face turned slightly away so that the shadows obscured his features. The only movement came from the faint rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. But something about him felt wrong. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like the weight of a storm just before it broke. The bobcat padded inside, its movements slow and deliberate, as if stepping onto sacred ground. It didn't look afraid. It looked like it belonged. Evelyn swallowed hard and forced herself to speak. "Sir," her voice wavered slightly. "Are you supposed to be here?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he turned his head. The light from the hallway spilled over his face, and Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. His eyes, they were the exact same shade of gold as the bobcat's. It wasn't just a similarity. It was identical. Same deep molten color. Same sharp, intelligent intensity. Same unnerving way they seemed to see straight through her. Her stomach twisted. No, that wasn't possible. That wasn't. "You heard her, didn't you?" The man finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. Evelyn's mouth went dry. She knew exactly what he meant. He was asking about Mrs. Holloway's last words. Take care of him. He knows the truth. Her pulse pounded against her ribs. "I..." She hesitated. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just studied her, his golden eyes unreadable. The bobcat sat beside him now, perfectly still, waiting. Something about their presence together made the room feel too small, too unreal. Evelyn took a shaky step closer, her medical instincts overriding her fear. Maybe this was just a coincidence. Maybe he was a relative of Mrs. Holloway's who happened to share a similar eye color. But deep down, she didn't believe that. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. And then, as if sensing her unspoken question, the man finally moved. He lifted his hand and placed it on the bobcat's head. Evelyn's breath caught, because the moment his fingers brushed against the animal's fur, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a normal movement. It wasn't a simple petting gesture. It was as if he and the bobcat were the same entity. The lights flickered overhead. The scent of flowers in the rain grew stronger. And Evelyn knew this was not just a man. Her stomach clenched. "What are you?" she whispered. For the first time, the man smiled. Not a wide grin, not even a smirk. Just the barest hint of amusement. "You already know," he said. And somehow, terrifyingly, she did. Her mind rebelled against the answer forming in the back of her consciousness, the impossible thought creeping in like a shadow. No, that was ridiculous. That was insane. But the way the bobcat stared at her, the way the man's golden eyes held hers, it couldn't be ignored. They were the same. Somehow, Impossibly, they were one. Evelyn's hands curled into fists. Her voice came out hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The man leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes glowing in the dim light. "To understand," he said simply. A chill ran down her spine. "Understand what?" He tilted his head, as if considering her carefully. "The truth," he murmured. Then, without warning, the Bobcat stood up, and the lights in the room went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Evelyn gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. A cold whisper brushed against her ear. "It's time, you see." And before she could scream, everything changed. The moment the lights went out, Evelyn's breath hitched. Total darkness swallowed the hospital room, suffocating and absolute. She couldn't see the Bobcat. She couldn't see the man. She couldn't even see her own hands in front of her face. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, hammering wildly in her chest. Then a whisper, not spoken out loud, but inside her mind. "Don't fight it. Just see." A sharp pressure bloomed at the back of her skull, as if something was pulling her consciousness, dragging her forward, forcing her to see beyond the boundaries of the physical world. And suddenly, she wasn't in the hospital anymore. The walls melted away. The floor beneath her vanished. She was standing in the middle of a vast, endless forest. Towering trees loomed above her, their twisted branches curling into the sky like reaching hands. The air smelled rich and damp, the scent of earth and pine filling her lungs. But something was wrong. The silence. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just stillness. Then a low growl. Evelyn whirled around. The Bobcat stood just a few feet away, but it wasn't alone. A second Bobcat stood beside it, then a third, then a fourth. Their golden eyes glowed in the dim light, all fixed directly on her. Evelyn's chest tightened. "What is this?" she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. A memory. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't inside her head. Evelyn turned and froze. The man from the hospital was standing there, except he wasn't just a man. Something shifted around him, like an unseen force that blurred the lines between human and something else. His golden eyes burned even brighter, his presence heavy and unshakable. "You want to know the truth," he said, stepping closer. "Now you will." And then the forest came alive. Shadows slithered between the trees, moving unnaturally fast. Figures emerged. At first, Evelyn thought they were people, but they weren't. They were creatures, half human, half beast, their eyes glowing like molten gold, their forms shifting between shapes, flickering between man and animal like a candle in the wind. Evelyn took a step back. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. They were the first. The man continued, his voice calm, almost reverent. The original shapeshifters. The ones who walk between two worlds. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say it was impossible. But she had already seen too much. She knew it was real. The figures moved in eerie unison, their eyes locked onto her. Not with hostility, but with knowing, as if they recognized her. Evelyn shuddered. "Why are you showing me this?" The man studied her for a long moment. Then he lifted his hand and pointed behind her. "Because you're a part of it, too." Evelyn turned, and what she saw stopped her heart. A woman stood there, not a shapeshifter, not a creature, just a woman, elderly, wrinkled. Her silver hair framed her kind face, and her eyes, those eyes. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. "Mrs. Holloway." The old woman smiled. "You always thought I was just an ordinary woman, didn't you, dear?" she said gently. Evelyn's pulse pounded. This wasn't possible. She was dead. She was dead. And yet, she was standing here, alive, warm, real. The Bobcat stepped forward, brushing against Mrs. Holloway's legs like a loyal companion. The pieces began to fall into place. The way the Bobcat had clung to the elderly woman. The way Mrs. Holloway had whispered those final words. "Take care of him. He knows the truth." The way the Bobcat had recognized Evelyn. Evelyn's hands trembled. She had spent years trying to understand life and death. studying the human body, the boundaries of science and medicine. But this was something beyond science, beyond logic, beyond anything she had ever known. Mrs. Holloway stepped closer, her expression gentle. "Evelyn," she said softly, "this is your bloodline." Evelyn's breath hitched. She tried to speak, tried to make sense of the impossible reality surrounding her. But before she could, the world shattered. The forest vanished. The figures disappeared. And Evelyn was back in the hospital. The lights flickered overhead. She was still standing in room 214. The Bobcat was still beside her. The man was still in the chair. But Mrs. Holloway was gone. Evelyn staggered backward, gasping for air, her mind spinning. Had she imagined it? Had it all been just a vision? She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. And that's when she saw it. A mark on her wrist. It hadn't been there before. A symbol ancient, intricate, glowing faintly beneath her skin. Evelyn's breath caught. The man stood up slowly, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "Now," he said quietly, "do you understand?" She did, and that realization changed everything. Evelyn wasn't just a doctor. She wasn't just a bystander in this story. She was part of it, part of the bloodline, part of something much, much bigger. And that's why she had no choice but to take the Bobcat home. Because it wasn't just an animal. It was a piece of her past. And now, it was her responsibility. Evelyn sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The hospital's parking lot was empty, the cold night air pressing against the windshield. Beside her, the Bobcat sat in the passenger seat, its golden eyes locked onto her, waiting, as if it knew she was struggling to process everything. The vision, the mark on her wrist, Mrs. Holloway's words, "This is your bloodline." Evelyn exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temples. This was madness. She had spent her entire life believing in logic, in science, and yet tonight had unraveled everything she thought she knew about the world. She glanced at the Bobcat. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a pet that belonged to an old woman. It was a key. To what? She wasn't sure. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't leave it behind. She turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The Bobcat didn't flinch. It just kept staring at her, as if it was waiting for her to make a choice. And Evelyn knew. There was no turning back now. The drive home felt surreal. The city lights blurred past her window, and the weight of the night pressed down on her like a storm cloud. She had spent years walking the clean, sterile halls of hospitals, believing she understood life and death. But now, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something much, much bigger. She glanced at the Bobcat. It sat perfectly still, regal in its posture, its golden eyes reflecting the passing streetlights. She knew she should be afraid, but she wasn't. She was curious. And deep down, she felt like she was meant to do this. She pulled into her driveway, cutting the engine. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at her house. Then, she turned to Bobcat. "Come on," she murmured. The Bobcat hopped out effortlessly, its movements smooth, almost too fluid for a normal animal. Evelyn swallowed hard and let it inside. Inside, the house was quiet. The Bobcat padded across the wooden floor, sniffing the air before settling in the middle of the living room. Evelyn hesitated. She had no idea what to do next. She had brought it home, but now what? She rubbed the mark on her wrist, her skin still tingling. Something inside her told her that the Bobcat had brought her this far for a reason. But what was it? She sat down across from the animal, studying it carefully. The golden eyes stared back at her, intelligent, patient, as if it knew something she didn't. Evelyn took a deep breath. "What are you?" she whispered. The Bobcat didn't move. But the moment she spoke the words, the lights flickered. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The air shifted. A strange, almost magnetic energy crackled around her, sending goosebumps across her skin. And then a voice. Soft, ancient. It didn't come from the Bobcat. It came from everywhere. "You already know the answer." Evelyn gasped. She whipped around, searching for the source. But there was no one else in the room. Just her and the bobcat. Its golden eyes glowed. And then it stood up. Evelyn's breath hitched. Something was changing. The air became dense, humming with unseen energy. The bobcats were seen to ripple like liquid gold. Evelyn's fingers dug into the carpet. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. She was rooted in place. And then the bobcat's form shifted, right in front of her. Bones stretched, limbs elongated. Its body twisted, bending the rules of nature, reshaping itself into something else. Something impossible. Evelyn's breath caught. And then he was standing there. A man, the same man from the hospital. The same golden eyes. The same quiet power. But now, standing in her living room, Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest. This wasn't possible. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The man, the bobcat, watched her in silence. Then he finally spoke. Now do you understand? Evelyn swallowed hard. Her world had just turned upside down. Everything she knew, everything she believed, it was all a lie. She wasn't just a doctor. She wasn't just an ordinary woman. She was part of something ancient, something hidden, something waiting to be awakened. And now she knew there was no turning back. Evelyn's breath was caught in her throat. The man standing before her had the same golden eyes as the bobcat, but he wasn't just a man. He was something else, something not human. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrest of the couch. The air was thick, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She could feel the weight of his presence, ancient, powerful, undeniable. She wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but her voice refused to come. The man took a slow step toward her, his movements just as fluid as the bobcat's had been. "You're afraid," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. Evelyn swallowed hard. "What are you?" The man studied her for a moment, then exhaled. "I am what I have always been," he said. "A guardian, a protector. And now—" His gaze softened. "So are you." Evelyn's head spun. No, this wasn't real. She was a doctor, a scientist. She believed in facts, in evidence. This was impossible. And yet, her wrist still burned where the mark had appeared. She had seen the impossible with her own eyes. She wasn't dreaming. This was real. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke again. "What do you mean, so am I?" The man's golden eyes seemed to peer straight into her soul. "You carry the blood of the old ones, Evelyn, just like Mrs. Holloway, just like me." Evelyn's breath hitched. She thought back to the old woman's final words. "This is your bloodline." But she wasn't related to Mrs. Holloway. Was she? She had never known her real family. She had been adopted as a baby, raised in a home that never spoke of her origins. Could it be? "You don't remember," the man said, watching her closely. Evelyn shook her head, her heart pounding. "No, I don't. I never knew my real parents." The man gave a slow nod. That was intentional. Evelyn's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a brief moment. Then he said softly, "They hid you to protect you." Evelyn's pulse roared in her ears. She felt like the floor beneath her was about to collapse. "From what?" she whispered. The man's expression darkened. "From those who would have destroyed you before you could awaken." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She felt sick, like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss she had never known existed. She shook her head. No, this doesn't make sense. But deep inside it did. Her whole life, she had felt like she didn't belong, like there was something missing. And now, piece by piece, the truth was unfolding in front of her. She wasn't just a doctor. She was something more, something ancient, something powerful. She looked down at the mark on her wrist. The man followed her gaze. "It's waking up," he said. Evelyn's heart pounded. "What happens when it does?" The man's golden eyes glowed. "You will finally remember who you are." The awakening. Evelyn barely had time to react before the pain hit her. A searing heat shot through her wrist, traveling up her arm like wildfire. She gasped, clutching it, but the pain only grew stronger. The room around her blurred. Her vision twisted. And suddenly, she was somewhere else. She saw flashes of a time long before hospitals, before cities, before the modern world. A forest. A woman standing beneath the moonlight, her golden eyes glowing just like his. A clan of guardians, hidden from the world. And then, fire, screams, shadowed figures hunting them down, wiping them out one by one. And a baby being carried away in the dead of night, hidden, protected. Her, Evelyn gasped, her body jolting back into the present. She was still on the floor of her living room, her hands trembling. The man was watching her, silent. "You saw it," he said. Evelyn could barely breathe. She nodded. She didn't just see it. She felt it. She remembered. She was part of something ancient, a lineage that had been nearly erased. And now she was the last. Tears burned her eyes. "Why didn't she tell me?" she whispered. Mrs. Holloway, she knew, didn't she? The man gave a slow nod. She was waiting for the right moment. Evelyn clenched her fists. And now she's gone. The man's expression didn't change. "No, she's not." Evelyn frowned, confused, and then she felt it. A warmth deep inside her chest. Not pain, not fear, but connection. Mrs. Holloway's legacy wasn't gone. It had simply passed on. Evelyn touched her wrist, her fingers brushing over the mark. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. She looked up at the man, the guardian who watched over Mrs. Holloway all these years. "What happens now?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Now you take your place." Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. She was no longer just a doctor. She was no longer just a woman searching for answers. She was the answer. She took a deep breath and stood up. The Bobcat, the guardian, smiled slightly. "Are you ready?" he asked. Evelyn lifted her chin. Her heart was pounding, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready. "Yes," she said. The golden eyes flashed, and the world changed forever.